Imagine standing on the ramparts of a city in the ancient Near East. The year is 740 before the Common Era. The sun is setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the plains, but the silence of the evening is broken by a sound that chills the blood of every man, woman, and child within the walls. It is the rhythmic, synchronized thud of boots, thousands of them marching in perfect unison. On the horizon, a dust cloud rises, blotting out the dying light. Through the haze, the glint of bronze and iron armor becomes visible. The Assyrians have arrived. For the people of this city, this moment marks the end of their world. It is not just an army approaching. It is a machine of destruction so sophisticated, so relentless, and so terrifying that it has no equal in the known world. Picture a society where the concept of mercy does not exist in the political vocabulary. A world where the sound of screaming is as common as the wind, and where the distinctive crack of iron-tipped battering rams against cedar gates is the soundtrack of the age. Between the 10th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire did not just conquer territory, they terraformed the psychological landscape of the Near East. From their heartland in northern Mesopotamia, centered around the great cities of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Ashur, they expanded outward with a ferocity that seemed supernatural to their victims. They built the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point, stretching from the snow-capped mountains of Ararat in modern-day Turkey to the scorching sands of the Egyptian Delta, and from the shores of the Mediterranean Sea deep into the Zagros Mountains of Persia. But to define the Assyrians merely by the size of their map is to miss the point entirely. Other empires were large. Other empires were powerful. But the Assyrians were the first to weaponize terror as a formal instrument of statecraft. They were the architects of a system where fear was not a byproduct of war, but its primary product. The Assyrians understood something fundamental about human nature, that the fear of death is often more powerful than death itself. They realized that if you could break the mind of your enemy before the first arrow was loosed, the battle was already won. This documentary will take you inside the machinery of the Assyrian state. We will dismantle the engine of their conquest to understand how it worked. We will look at the logistical brilliance that allowed them to campaign year-round, the technological innovations that made their sieges unstoppable, and the chillingly bureaucratic methods they used to deport entire populations. We will examine the inscriptions they left behind, boasts of flaying, impaling, and burning, that were carved into stone, not as confessions of guilt, but as advertisements of power. This is the story of how the Assyrians built a civilization on the foundation of nightmares, and why in the end that foundation crumbled under the weight of the fear it created. To understand the Assyrian terror, one must first understand the Assyrian military machine. Before the middle of the 8th century, before the Common Era, warfare in the ancient world was largely seasonal. Armies were composed of citizen militias, farmers who would take up spears and shields after the spring planting and fight until the autumn harvest demanded their return to the fields. This limited the scope of warfare. Campaigns had to be short, and sieges could not last indefinitely without risking famine at home. But in 745 before the Common Era, a usurper king named Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the throne of Assyria. He was a visionary administrator who fundamentally changed the rules of the game. He realized that to build a true empire, he needed an army that answered to the king alone, not to the seasons. Tiglath-Pileser III created the world's first professional standing army. These were not farmers with pitchforks. These were career soldiers. They lived in barracks, they drilled daily, and they were paid from the royal treasury. This innovation was cataclysmic for Assyria's neighbors. Suddenly, the Assyrian army could march in winter. They could maintain sieges for years if necessary, waiting out the food supplies of any rebellious city. They could field multiple armies on different fronts simultaneously. The scale of this force was staggering. Ancient sources and modern estimates suggest the Assyrians could mobilize well over 100,000 men, a number that was virtually unstoppable in the Iron Age. This standing army was supported by a logistical infrastructure that rivals modern military organizations. They built a network of royal roads flattened and paved designed specifically for the rapid movement of troops and chariots. Along these roads, they established a system of supply depots and armories. An Assyrian army marching into the Levant, or the Zagros Mountains, did not need to forage for food. They arrived with their own logistics train, or they resupplied at pre-stocked garrisons. This allowed them to project power thousands of miles from their capital. Furthermore, they revolutionized military technology. They were the first to mass-produce iron weapons, which were stronger and more durable than the bronze weapons of their enemies. They perfected the siege engine, building massive wheeled towers covered in damp leather to prevent fire-housing battering rams that could shatter stone walls. They employed corps of engineers who could dig tunnels to undermine fortifications or build ramps to storm the battlements. Against this professional, year-round, technologically superior juggernaut, the seasonal militias of Syria, Israel, and Babylon stood little chance. The Assyrians didn't just defeat armies, they dismantled them with the precision of a butcher. But military might was only one arm of the Assyrian strategy. The other was psychological warfare executed with a theatrical brutality that still shocks historians today. Punishment in the Assyrian Empire was never a private affair. It was a public spectacle designed to be witnessed, remembered, and retold. When a city defied the Assyrian king, the response was not just conquest, it was performative destruction. The Assyrians wanted the news of their cruelty to travel faster than their armies. They wanted the next city down the road to open its gates in terror before a single siege tower was built. This policy is explicitly detailed in their royal inscriptions. King Ashurnasir Paul II, who ruled in the 9th century before the Common Era, left behind steel engravings that read like a catalogue of horrors. "I built a pillar over against the city gate," he boasts, "and I flayed all the chiefs who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skin." Flaying, the removal of skin from a living victim, was a favored tactic for rebel leaders. It was a slow, agonizing death that served a dual purpose. It inflicted maximum suffering on the individual, and it created a gruesome permanent monument for the community. The skins would be nailed to the city walls, bleaching in the sun, a constant reminder of the price of defiance. For the common soldiers who fought against Assyria, the punishment was often impalement. The Assyrians would erect forests of stakes outside a conquered city. Prisoners would be driven onto these stakes, left to die slowly of internal trauma and exposure. Imagine walking toward a city and seeing hundreds of men dying on poles, their moans carrying on the wind. This was the landscape of the Assyrian Empire. It was a visual language of domination. This brutality wasn't random savagery, it was state policy. It was religiously sanctioned. The Assyrian king was the vicar of the national god Ashur. To rebel against the king was to rebel against the cosmic order itself. Therefore, the torture and execution of rebels were not crimes. They were acts of piety, restoring balance to the universe. Assyrian palace reliefs, the stone carvings that line the walls of their throne rooms, depict these scenes in graphic detail. We see soldiers holding severed heads. We see scribes counting piles of hands cut from living prisoners. We see captives being blinded with spears. These images were not hidden in dungeons. They were carved into the walls where foreign ambassadors would wait for an audience with the king. The message was unmistakable. Look at what we do. Look at what happens when you say no. It was diplomacy by intimidation, and for centuries it worked perfectly. For the civilian populations caught in the path of the Assyrian war machine, survival was a roll of the dice. If your city surrendered immediately, you might be spared the worst of the violence, but you would be subjected to heavy tribute. Your king would kiss the feet of the Assyrian monarch, your temples would be stripped of their gold, and your sons would be conscripted into the Assyrian army to fight their wars. But if your city resisted, or if you were part of a rebellious region, you faced a different fate: mass deportation. This was the Assyrians' most significant contribution to the dark arts of imperialism. They invented the systematic state-sponsored forced migration of entire peoples. Between the 9th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, historians estimate that the Assyrians forcibly relocated 4.5 million people. In the context of the ancient world, where populations were much smaller, this was a demographic upheaval of apocalyptic proportions. The logic behind deportation was cold and rational. The Assyrians wanted to break the connection between a people and their land. They knew that a man fighting for his ancestral home, for the graves of his fathers and the altars of his gods, would fight to the death. But if you take that man, march him 500 miles away, and drop him in a strange land where he doesn't speak the language or know the terrain, he becomes dependent on the state for survival. He ceases to be a rebel and becomes a subject. This policy also served an economic purpose. The Assyrians were master planners. They would move skilled craftsmen, masons, weavers, metalworkers, from conquered cities to the Assyrian heartland to build their palaces and temples. They would move farmers to depopulated regions to bring new land under cultivation, increasing the empire's agricultural output. The deportation of the Israelites is the most famous example of this policy. In 722, before the Common Era, King Sargon II captured Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. His inscriptions record that he deported 27,290 people. He scattered them across the empire, some to the cities of the Medes in Iran, others to the Assyrian heartland. In their place, he brought in people from Babylon and Syria to settle in Samaria. This was a technique of population mixing designed to erase national identities. The 10 lost tribes of Israel were not lost in a mystical sense. They were assimilated. They were dissolved into the melting pot of the Assyrian Empire, their culture and religion slowly fading away as they married into other displaced groups. This was cultural genocide by logistics. Let us zoom in on the experience of these deportees. We often gloss over the human reality of such statistics, but the archaeological and textual record gives us glimpses of their suffering. Imagine being given hours to pack your belongings. Assyrian reliefs show families leaving their burning cities carrying sacks of grain and holding the hands of their children. They show ox carts loaded with meager possessions. The journey itself was a death march. Deportees were forced to walk hundreds of miles, often in chains or with their necks in wooden yokes. They crossed deserts and mountain ranges, exposed to the elements, dependent on their captors for water and food. The Assyrians provided rations not out of kindness, but because livestock is useless if it dies before reaching the market. They needed these people alive to work. However, the weak, the elderly, and the very young often did not survive. Assyrian art depicts soldiers killing those who could not keep up, leaving their bodies for the vultures. Disease was a constant companion on these marches. Dysentery, typhus, and dehydration claimed thousands. Once they reached their destination, the psychological trauma continued. They were strangers in a strange land. A farmer from the hills of Judea might find himself working the irrigation canals of Babylon. A merchant from the Mediterranean coast might be sent to the rugged frontier of Urartu. Their social structures were shattered. Their priests were gone, their temples destroyed. They had to learn new languages, worship new gods, and serve new masters. For those who were not deported but remained in the conquered territories, life was a grinding existence of servitude. The Assyrian Empire was a vampire state. It sucked the wealth from the periphery to feed the center. The tribute lists are staggering. Subject kings were required to send annual payments of gold, silver, tin, copper, linen, horses, and cattle. If a king failed to pay, or if he paid too little, the Assyrian army would return. This created a cycle of debt and extraction that impoverished the subject provinces. The grand palaces of Nineveh, with their hanging gardens and gold-plated doors, were built on the backs of millions of exploited laborers. The magnificence of Assyrian art was paid for by the poverty of the Near East. The arbitrariness of life under Assyrian rule was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. There was no rule of law as we understand it for subject peoples. There was only the will of the king and his governors. A skilled potter might be deported to Nineveh and live a relatively comfortable life, working in the royal workshops, his skills valued and rewarded. His neighbor, a farmer with no special skills, might be enslaved and sent to work in the copper mines, a death sentence of hard labor and toxic fumes. A third man might be impaled simply because the local governor needed to make an example to quell a minor riot. There was no logic to survival, other than utility to the state. You survived if you were useful. You died if you were an obstacle. This system created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety. The Bible, written by people who lived under the shadow of Assyria, describes them as a force of nature, a scourge from God. The prophet Isaiah describes the Assyrian army. Their arrows are sharp, all their bows are bent, their horses' hooves seem like flint, their chariot wheels like a whirlwind. To the ancient world, the Assyrians seemed invincible, a juggernaut that could not be stopped. For 300 years this was true. They crushed coalition after coalition. They defeated the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Elamites, the Hittites. They seemed to have broken the code of empire, creating a structure that was immune to resistance. But the seeds of their destruction were sown in the very methods of their success. The Assyrian Empire was a military state, not a political one. It ruled through fear, not consensus. It demanded submission, not loyalty. There was no concept of Assyrian citizenship for conquered peoples, no way to buy into the system and become a stakeholder. You were either a master or a slave. This meant that the empire had millions of subjects, but very few friends. It required constant, exhausting military intervention to keep the lid on the boiling pot of rebellion. The moment the Assyrian army showed weakness, the moment the king fell ill or a civil war broke out over the succession, the subject peoples would rise up. The end, when it came, was swift and apocalyptic. By the late 7th century before the Common Era, the Assyrian war machine was running on fumes. Decades of constant campaigning had drained the manpower of the Assyrian heartland. The countryside was depopulated, the farms were neglected. The empire was overextended, trying to control too much territory with too few soldiers. And the enemies of Assyria, having learned from their masters, began to unite. In 626, before the Common Era, a Chaldean general named Nabopolassar seized the throne of Babylon. He didn't just want independence, he wanted revenge. He formed an alliance with the Medes, a fierce people from the Iranian plateau, who had also suffered under the Assyrian yoke. Together, the Babylonians and the Medes launched a war of extermination against Assyria. They didn't want to conquer the empire, they wanted to kill it. In 612, before the Common Era, their combined armies laid siege to Nineveh, the greatest city in the world. The siege lasted for 3 months. When the walls were finally breached, archaeological evidence suggests the damming of the Kosor River may have washed away a section of the defenses. The result was a massacre that mirrored the worst excesses of the Assyrians themselves. The hatred that had been bottled up for centuries exploded. The city was sacked with a ferocity that stunned the ancient world. The palaces were burned. The temples were smashed. The population was slaughtered or enslaved. The archaeological record at Nineveh shows a layer of ash and destruction debris that covers the site. Unburied bodies were found in the gateway's soldiers who died fighting to the last man. The destruction was so complete that within 200 years, when the Greek mercenary Xenophon marched past the ruins of Nineveh, he didn't even recognize them. The greatest city on earth had become a mound of dust, its name forgotten by the locals. The Assyrian Empire didn't just fall, it was erased. The fall of Assyria serves as a grim historical lesson on the limits of power based solely on terror. The Assyrians built a magnificent machine of conquest. They advanced the sciences of administration, logistics, and engineering. They created art of breathtaking power and realism, but they failed to build a society that anyone wanted to be part of. They ruled by the sword and they died by the sword. When their military power faltered, there was no residual loyalty to save them. Their subjects didn't mourn their passing, they celebrated it. The prophet Nahum, writing about the fall of Nineveh, asks a rhetorical question that echoes through history. Who has not felt your endless cruelty today? We stand among the ruins of their palaces and museums in London, Paris, and Baghdad. We look at the stone reliefs of lion hunts and war chariots. We read the cuneiform tablets that boast of burning cities and flaying kings. And we are left with a complex legacy. The Assyrians showed us the dark potential of organized human effort. They showed us that a state can be efficient, advanced, cultured, and utterly sociopathic at the same time. They were the pioneers of imperialism, the first to dream of a world united under a single ruler. But the nightmare they unleashed to achieve that dream ensured that they would be remembered not as unifiers, but as destroyers. If you could somehow survive 24 hours in the Assyrian Empire, you would learn a fundamental truth about civilization: that order without justice is just tyranny in a fancy uniform. You would see that fear can hold an empire together for a time, perhaps even for centuries, but it is a brittle mortar. Eventually, the cracks appear. Eventually, the people you have terrified will stop being afraid and start being angry. And when that happens, no amount of iron weapons or stone walls can save you. The Assyrian Empire serves as a monument to the ultimate futility of rule by terror, a colossus with feet of clay destined to crumble into the sands of time, leaving behind only the echo of its own violence.